The new M4 iPad Pro has never been better, and with its new Magic Keyboard, it looks more like a laptop than ever before, especially when you put it side by side against Apple's latest M3 MacBook Pro. And you may find yourself asking, which one is the better laptop? Well, we're going to do an old-fashioned showdown and put this iPad against this MacBook Pro in a head-to-head competition over various categories to finally figure out which one is the king of the portable computing world. And let's kick it off with a big one, price. Because this is a category you might expect a certain product to just win out just by looking at the base prices. Because if you look at the M4 iPad Pro, the 13-inch model retails for $1,300, and the M3 MacBook Pro comes in at a more expensive $1,600. An easy win for the iPad Pro, right? Well, not so fast, because in this competition, we have to do our best to compare identical specs. So this iPad Pro now starts with 256 gigabytes of base storage, while the MacBook Pro starts with 512 gigabytes. That's double the storage, right? So if we take the price point of this iPad Pro to that same specification at 512 gigabytes, well, it actually retails for $1,500. Furthermore, we have to be fair. I started this video off by saying which one would be the better laptop. And with this iPad Pro, we are using Apple's new Magic Keyboard accessory. So, unfortunately, this Magic Keyboard accessory is pretty pricey. It adds $350 to the 13-inch iPad Pro's pricing. And that brings our total up to $1,850. Even if we made the argument that the iPad Pro doesn't need 512 gigabytes of storage and we revert these specifications back to the base model, you're still looking at a $50 price increase for the total package against the MacBook Pro. And that's without even adding other accessories like the Apple Pencil Pro, which adds another $130 onto the total iPad Pro package. Now, yeah, if you go for the cheaper 11-inch model, you could argue that this makes it a better value than the 14-inch MacBook. And if you price it out similarly, well, it's $100 cheaper than the MacBook Pro. But again, we're primarily comparing the 13-inch iPad, which makes it a better laptop alternative. So I'm gonna notch this as a value win for the MacBook Pro. Now, let's talk about thickness. No, stop that. We're running a family show here, guys. Get rid of that graphic. Let's talk about portability. Now, Apple boasts pretty highly that the new iPad Pro is their thinnest product ever. The 13-inch model is only 5.1 millimeters. So I thought it was only fair to add this into the comparison. And yeah, with just the tablet, the iPad Pro looks 10 years ahead in design compared to the thicker MacBook Pro. It is crazy how thin the iPad Pro is, and it houses everything: the computer, the battery, the screen, the cameras. It is crazy when you just put it side by side against the full MacBook Pro package. But again, we gotta be fair here. We're doing this as a laptop replacement, so we have to add the Magic Keyboard onto this iPad. Now, one thing I was curious to see was how thin is the iPad Pro in total when attached with this new Magic Keyboard, because in the past, the old Magic Keyboard added a lot of thickness to the design, making the total package very comparable to a MacBook Pro. However, with Apple's new sleeker design, it actually makes a pretty nice difference, and the iPad Pro with the keyboard is thinner than the 14-inch MacBook Pro. I was also curious to see the weight of this total iPad keyboard combo, because the last generation iPad Pro weighed about 3 pounds in total when attached to the Magic Keyboard. This time though, Apple has reduced the weight of the iPad Pro to just 1.28 pounds on the 13-inch model. Interestingly enough, they also shaved off weight from the keyboard of about 50 grams. And with that weight reduction, the Magic Keyboard actually weighs more than the iPad Pro itself at 1.45 pounds. Now, with this weight reduction, it actually puts the weight about the same as the MacBook Air, but the MacBook Pro is heftier than the Air. It weighs at 3.4 pounds, so the iPad Pro beats this out in weight and thickness, and overall, it is a more compact form factor that wins for general portability. Now, we've spent some time talking about this keyboard accessory, so we might as well compare the actual keyboard and trackpad against each other. The MacBook Pro keyboard is the gold standard at this point. It has responsive keys with short travel that to me feel precise and punchy to type on. It's a good keyboard and one that I have spent a lot of time writing on. The trackpad is even more so the more gold standard than the keyboard because it's an iconic part of the MacBook experience with its generous size and glass material for smooth and responsive scrolling or gestures. And the haptic feedback that lets you press anywhere on the trackpad and it still feels like you press the trackpad, even though it's just haptic feedback, it feels like a click. Every time I click it, it registers as a click. I love it. And thankfully, everything I love about the Magic Keyboard for the MacBook Pro has been brought over to the iPad Pro's Magic Keyboard. It features very similar keys and even includes a row of function keys on the top for quick actions like changing the volume or brightness or quickly enabling Do Not Disturb when everyone's trying to message you during a very important video recording session. I'm not saying that happened now. I am saying it happened. It also now receives the same Magic Trackpad design with a smooth glass finish and haptic feedback that feels just as good as the MacBook Pro's, although the trackpad is a little bit smaller, but honestly, it's still a nicely sized trackpad. I don't think that matters too much. Now, I think I could potentially give the win to the MacBook Pro keyboard because it does have like a bigger function key row and that larger trackpad, but the new Magic Keyboard on the iPad Pro also has slight advantages like the keys going more to the edge and the slimmer metal palm rest feeling slightly more comfortable to me. Plus the keys also come in white, which is really cool. So listen, they're both great keyboards. They're both very similar. It might be controversial, but I'm giving this category a tie. That's right. Nobody wins. You don't win. I don't win. These two don't win. But all right, keyboards, who cares about that? Let's get to a big category, display. The M3 MacBook Pro comes with a big, beautiful 14-inch ProMotion mini LED display that looks fantastic. It gets up to 600 nits of brightness for SDR content, and it gets up to 1600 nits of brightness for peak brightness when playing HDR video. It also has a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio, and of course, buttery smooth 120 Hz that makes animation, scrolling, and everything you do just feel fluid and responsive. The MacBook Pro, it's a great display, and it has an advantage over the iPad Pro as being noticeably larger, which gives you extra space to view content and to multitask. However, in terms of overall display quality, it is now behind the iPad Pro's new tandem OLED display, which uses two OLED panels to achieve some impressive specifications. First of all, it can get brighter than the MacBook Pro at 1000 nits of full screen brightness. Not just in HDR, it can do that in SDR, and it can still reach the same 1600 nits of peak brightness when watching HDR content. It also doubles the contrast ratio to 2,000,000:1 and has deep inky black levels. But to be fair, the MacBook Pro kind of does too. But the OLED panel, it just takes that like a step further. And the OLED panel can actually turn on and off individual pixels. So when it renders a darker scene, it can individually set those pixels off, while the MacBook Pro uses mini LED display technology, which can only turn off those backlights in zones. Under most circumstances, this results in, again, very similar inky black scenes, just like an OLED display. Except because it controls the backlight in zones, you can sometimes run into what they call display blooming. This is when light spills into the darker areas of an image. For example, if you have white text against a dark background, it might appear that the text almost has a halo around it. Whereas with the OLED display on the iPad Pro, well, you have no such issue. Furthermore, the OLED display on the iPad Pro also has a lower response time of 5 milliseconds compared to the mini LED's 39 milliseconds. This means that it appears even smoother with less smearing, or I guess ghosting, I don't know, I guess it's like smearing compared to the MacBook Pro's display. To sum it up as best as I can, both displays are great. I'm honestly shocked because I thought this new OLED display was gonna blow away the MacBook Pro, but the MacBook Pro I thought held up really well. But when I look at display quality overall and I nitpick it, the iPad Pro, it's just ahead here. The OLED display is better quality than the mini LED display. So yeah, I guess the iPad Pro wins this. Oh, and yeah, I didn't forget. The iPad Pro also has a touchscreen. You can touch it. You can't do that on a Mac. So even if it was a tie on the display quality, well, because you can touch it, I mean, the iPad Pro, it clearly wins. I'm almost tempted to give it 2 points, but I'm gonna give it 1. It's my rules, my video. 1 point for the iPad Pro display. Now hold up though. The MacBook Pro isn't going down without a fight because the display is half the story. What about the audio? What about the speakers? Well, for a tablet, the iPad Pro has an impressive 4 audio speaker system that does sound decently rich for its incredibly thin profile. And yeah, it does sound reasonably good. That is until you compare it against the 14-inch MacBook Pro's 6-speaker system. The MacBook Pro offers impressive room-filling sound that gets louder, richer, more detailed, and has more bass than the iPad Pro. To skew that even further, the MacBook Pro also has a headphone jack, which makes connecting good-sounding headphones much easier than on the iPad Pro, which only has a single USB-C port. In fact, let's rip the Band-Aid off right now. Oh, the MacBook Pro wins the speaker if I wasn't clear. Let's talk about I/O. I think it's pretty clear, but yeah, the iPad Pro, it only has a single Thunderbolt USB-C cable connection, and when it's paired to the Magic Keyboard, it only gains 1 additional USB-C port, which can only be used to charge the device. The MacBook Pro, on the other hand, well, it has 2 of those Thunderbolt USB-C ports, so it's almost like it won already, but Apple also has a dedicated MagSafe charging port on here, an HDMI port, and an SD card slot, and as I mentioned before, a headphone jack. So when it comes to I/O, when it comes to ports, the MacBook Pro easily wins this one. All right, let's tackle authentication, because we have 2 very different technologies to unlock your Mac or your iPad. The iPad Pro, of course, has a Face ID sensor, which is now positioned in the landscape camera orientation. And that actually fixes a lot of issues I've had with previous iPad Pros where sometimes you're holding the device in landscape mode and you easily cover up the Face ID sensor. Now that's mostly fixed on the iPad if you use your iPad in landscape mode. If you use it in portrait mode, then maybe it's the other annoyance. The MacBook Pro, of course, gets Touch ID in the top right of the power button, which is usually easy enough to reach up and press whenever you need to log into the Mac. And both are pretty fast for bypassing the lock screen and logging in. But here's the thing. I much prefer Face ID for everything else. Like when you go into Safari and autofill a password on the iPad, it's so automatic. You click the password box, Face ID instantly activates, it scans your face, and yeah, there it is. Your password's autofilled, no thoughts required. On the MacBook Pro, well, you get a notification saying to touch ID to autofill the passwords, and it requires you to kind of just think for a second before you place your finger on the Touch ID sensor. So Face ID is really good, and it's even better on a device when you're using it attached to a keyboard in laptop mode because the camera's constantly pointed at your face. For example, look how fast I can get into my iPad Pro from the lock screen. I just double tap the spacebar twice and I'm in. That's it. Overall, while both are great, I gotta give Face ID the winner here. Well, what about cameras? The MacBook Pro comes with a front-facing 1080p camera. It's not gonna win any awards for video quality, but it gets the job done for a video call. The iPad Pro also features a 1080p video camera on the front. The front-facing camera overall for the iPad is quite different. Number one, it has a much wider angle field of view because it uses the center stage feature, so it can follow you around and it can crop into the image, which does make the image look a little less detailed than I would like. But I do like the center stage feature where it tracks you and follows you around. I think that's really cool, and the Mac doesn't have that. It also has a true depth camera because of Face ID, so you can add in effects like portrait mode, and unlike in previous years where you maybe would have given the MacBook Pro a slight edge when you're using it as a laptop because of the camera orientation, well, this time around the iPad Pro has the camera positioned in the same landscape mode, which makes the position just as good as the MacBooks when using it in keyboard mode. Furthermore, there's also a rear camera on the back of the iPad, which I know kinda gets made fun of because who takes photos on an iPad? But hey, it's also great for scanning documents, and it even has a flash now to help with that. Besides, the MacBook Pro doesn't even have a camera on the rear, so even if the front cameras were a tie, I'd have to give it to the iPad Pro by default for just having the additional camera on the back. All right, it's halftime. Let's take a look at who's winning so far. Ooh, the iPad is winning a lot. I don't know if there's any hope for the MacBook, but wait a minute.
Call an ambulance! Call an ambulance! But not for me!
That's right, because we're talking about battery life now. According to Apple, the iPad's battery life has literally never changed, and it constantly targets the same battery life for the iPad every single year, with 10 hours of usage. However, that is not the same for Apple's MacBooks, which have gotten a lot better with their battery ever since the adoption of Apple Silicon, with the 14-inch M3 MacBook Pro receiving the highest battery life rating out of any MacBook ever, with 22 hours of battery life. How is Apple's MacBook Pro getting so much more battery life over the iPad? 12 more hours according to Apple? Well, it actually makes a lot of sense when you look at the battery sizes of these devices. The M3 MacBook Pro has a 70 watt-hour battery compared to the 38.99 watt-hour battery on the M4 iPad Pro. I probably could have just said 39 and rounded up, but I'm gonna be specific here. In years past, the iPad would probably win out in battery life against like the Intel Macs because it just used a much lower powered chip, but now the Macs and iPads are kind of using the same M series chip architecture. Now, yes, the MacBook Pro has an M3 chip, and Apple says the M4 is more efficient in the iPad Pro, but there's just so much more battery capacity in the MacBook Pro that it easily wins out in battery life. I don't even need to do a side-by-side battery test rating these things. Like, it's double the battery. There's no amount of efficiency the M4 could achieve that would make it better than this MacBook Pro. That brings us another important thing to talk about, performance. Now, I actually didn't know how this was gonna pan out because on paper, the M4 has an advantage over the M3 MacBook Pro. It is literally the next chip generation, and it should be faster, and on paper, it is faster. And if you compare benchmark results, you'll see it's about 20 to 25% faster in single core and multi-core performance over the M3. However, the MacBook Pro does have one advantage going for it. It does have a physical fan and it is thicker, which will help cool off that M3 chip for sustained workloads. So even though it's weaker, could it be more powerful due to the fact that it doesn't have to thermally throttle as much? So I was really interested to test this, but I have to be honest with you. I'm not sure if I really devised a good way to do this. My normal test is to compete these systems against two workloads that I'm familiar with. But that kind of requires identical apps. Now, yes, the iPad Pro does have Final Cut Pro, but so does the Mac. But let's be honest, Final Cut on the Mac isn't exactly the same program as it is on the iPad. Still, I figured they were similar enough, right? So I ran a video export and we can see that the M4 chip's new video encoder is doing some serious work here. Not only did the M4 iPad Pro beat the M3 MacBook Pro export time by around 30 seconds, but I went to go touch the back of it expecting it to maybe be warm, and it was cool to the touch. And I even ran like a longer export to see if I could throttle the performance in some way, and I had no such luck. I then ran a 3D benchmark to see how GPU performance stacked up, and once again, the M4 iPad Pro came out on top against the M3 MacBook Pro. I also figured another way to test performance is with gaming, so I loaded up a game that both systems have, which is Resident Evil Village. This is a game where you can actually customize the graphics settings, so I set Resident Evil Village on high on both machines, and they both performed pretty well. But to my shock, the M4 iPad Pro seemed to perform better. The most shocking thing to me, though, was that the MacBook Pro, when I picked it up after playing this game, felt a little warm, and the iPad Pro in that thin body without a fan did not. Now, yes, I'm sure you can find examples where the fan in the MacBook Pro is gonna give it some sort of advantage in sustained performance over the M4 chip in the iPad Pro. But I guess you could make the same argument for the iPad Pro with like burst speeds. The M4 is gonna win out for shorter workloads no matter what, and it may even win out in longer workloads based on my own testing. So let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. The M4, it's a new chip generation over the M3, so at least to me, right now, the iPad Pro has better performance than the base M3 MacBook Pro. All right, the winner, this can only be decided by one category, the operating system. Now, when you picture iPadOS, you probably picture the classic way of using an iPad. One app open at a time with a single focus, and it's a pretty simple and easy way to use a computer. A paradigm everyone understands because it works exactly the same way as the phone you have in your pocket. while macOS may require a bit of a learning curve if you're not used to it, and introduces further complexities on how to use its desktop operating system. However, iPadOS over the years has also become a lot more complex as an operating system, and Apple has added some new multitasking paradigms that elevate it from your typical one app at a time iPhone experience. In its simplest version, you can add a split screen app side by side against another app using kind of a tiling system approach. You could even drag over one smaller iPhone size window that kind of forms like a slide overview that overlaps another window, and then pull in a floating picture-in-picture video. It is a simple way to multitask, and it's generally the way that I prefer to use my iPad, and it beats the hassle of the side-by-side window placement on the default macOS settings. But that doesn't mean Apple has added even more attempts at making the iPad even more complex. In more recent years, Apple has even added windowed multitasking in a feature called Stage Manager. This is an optional mode in iPadOS controlled by toggling it in Control Center that lets you run windowed applications on your iPad. Now, for the most part, it works okay, and yes, you can get windowed applications on your iPad, but there are some serious limitations. Firstly, you can only have 4 apps active at the same time, and that is a hard limit there. Whereas on macOS, you can of course get an unlimited amount of open windows and applications on your display. And because these windows are generally a lot bigger on the iPad, it makes the already limited 13-inch screen size feel even more limited. So even though you can have 4 apps on here, it's a lot more comfortable with around 2 to 3. Now, one thing I like about Stage Manager is it does try and help you organize and clean up all of these windows, and you can group 4 apps off to the side and quickly access that grouping. However, there's no denying that the default macOS window management just offers so much more freedom and flexibility when it comes to multitasking. And even if you really like Stage Manager and you like the way that you can organize windows, well, you can also get that same feature on macOS, and it actually seems to work better on macOS. There's also just other things macOS as an operating system handles so much better than iPadOS. One of my favorite examples is macOS doesn't put limits on additional audio sources, so you can listen to music or a podcast or a video or really any other audio source. You can listen to all of that all at the same time. Whereas on iPadOS, Apple limits you to just one audio source at a time. You may ask yourself, well, why is this a big deal? Who's listening to 2 music tracks at the same time while watching a YouTube video? Well, that's a bad way to look at it, because what most users probably run into is something like this. Say you're listening to music on your iPad and you open an app like Twitter at the same time, and then an advertisement pops up or one of those auto-playing videos and it hijacks your iPad, well, then your music stops. Or what if you want to listen to music while you edit a video? Again, on the Mac, no problem. On the iPad, yeah, you get the point. You can only have one audio source at a time. It is an annoying system limitation that seems to be there just because, well, that's how it's done on the iPhone. And you'll run into small little annoying examples like this on iPadOS time and time again. Another example I love to bring up is exporting a video. On the Mac, you can of course export a video, and you can still use your computer to do other tasks. On the iPad, well, you have to keep Final Cut Pro open in full screen, and if you exit out even for a second, your export stops. Yes, you can kind of bypass this on iPad if you use Stage Manager, but again, if you click out of that Stage Manager view, the Final Cut Pro export will stop. I even ran into this just importing footage into Final Cut Pro on the iPad. I had to keep the app open. If I exited, the import failed. Listen, there are so many examples I could go over, like how I find it easier to manage files on macOS with its folder and desktop system compared to files on the iPad, or how you have more freedom to install apps on the Mac just by going to the web and not using the store. Then on the iPad, you can't do that because you only have access to the App Store, and on and on and on and on. macOS, let's be frank, it's just a more robust operating system than iPadOS. It's my favorite and last example of this, and I think this really sums it all up. You can run iPad apps on the Mac, but you can't run macOS apps on the iPad. So for me, macOS, it's a clear win with its operating system. All right, drum roll please. A big reveal. Let's add up the scores. And 1, square root, and It's a tie. I didn't want this to be a tie. I didn't plan for this to be a tie. We need a winner. You know what that means? Lightning round. Colors. No. Size. Options. No. Bend test. No. I got it. The Greg factor. Which device does Greg prefer? And that's right, it's my video. I get to award the last point. And for me, that device is one I can currently live without. The iPad. What I'm trying to say here is it doesn't get the point. Because I still feel like macOS is something I need in my life. And if I was going to get rid of one of these devices, even though I'm really enjoying my experience on this new hardware for the iPad Pro, I gotta say that I would still pick the Mac ultimately. Oh, what? You didn't like that? You didn't like me just giving the win to the Mac because I said so? What, do you think life is fair? Life isn't fair. Let me clue you in on something. Life sucks, and then you die. Listen, this scoring system is ultimately pointless. In some areas, the iPad Pro wins. In some areas, the MacBook Pro wins. And at the end of the day, you need to decide which product is right for you based on what you value more. And if you want the most cutting-edge hardware with the best display, not to mention a touchscreen that supports the Apple Pencil, it's not even something I included in this video because it's kind of hard to, compare that with the MacBook because you can't touch it. There's no touchscreen. It doesn't matter how many points I award the MacBook Pro in this video. If you're something like an artist and you need an iPad and you need an application like Procreate and you draw on the iPad, even if I gave this all the points to the Mac, you still shouldn't pick it because you need a tool like the Apple Pencil to use an iPad. I'm jumbling my words here. I'm going crazy because this video is so long. But yes, if you're someone that can utilize a certain feature on the iPad, of course, it is going to take priority. And it doesn't matter what I say because it's all personal preference. Likewise, for me and a lot of users, the MacBook Pro has a lot of practical benefits for it over the iPad Pro. In a way, looking at these two things now, it may be the more boring product, but it's also the most tried and true. And if you need better multitasking, file management, or just certain apps that do not run on the iPad, well, this is clearly going to be the one to get. But overall, I hope this video helped you out in deciding between the MacBook Pro and the iPad Pro. Let me know in the comments below. What do you think is a better product? Which one would you pick up? As always, if you liked the video, I appreciate a like. If you want to see more, get subscribed. I'm sorry if the video got a little unhinged at the end, but I've just been recording this for 40 minutes now. So, thanks for watching. If you made it to this point, I love you. I'll always love you. Take care. Have a nice day and a good week. Happy, what's Memorial Day? Happy Memorial Day.